Hello and welcome to my review of The Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. Eaters of the Dead was first published in 1976 and would later become the basis for the movie The 13th Warrior. My interest in the book actually does come from the film, which I describe as pretty good, but I always felt that somewhere out there there's a 3-hour cut of that movie that develops some of the characters and themes more than the movie does and is better for it. However, the movie and The Eaters of the Dead are extremely similar, with one offering very little that isn't contained in the other. As in the movie, the text begins with the Arabic ambassador Ibn Fadlan performing a journey that is half exile, half diplomatic mission. Along the way he crosses paths with some Vikings and is unwillingly dragged into their mission, rescuing a settlement threatened by an unnameable foe. Fadlan is mostly an observer, or historian at any rate, during what follows. His ability to write and accurately report is tested by the Vikings, especially their leader, Bolvi, a king who left his kingdom behind in order to find his own home destroyed by the very same threat, by now named as the feral and vicious Wendell. They travel on to the threatened home of another king, Hrothgar. What follows is beat for beat represented in the movie. They investigate a home that has been attacked, finding evidence of the Wendell. They visit Hrothgar. They fight the Wendell the first night. They build some defences, and in the process deal with the covetous prince by killing his friend Ragnar in a duel. In a brief section that is not actually in the film, they travel to the Wendell's settlement. They find it empty, and then they go and ask advice from dwarfs who are considered magical. They then swim through a cave into the Wendell's lair, kill their mother, and then return to the village where a dying Bolvi leads them into their final battle. The book then offers very little that isn't shown more or less identically in the film, which offers nothing at all that isn't in the book. The early section is longer in the book than it is in the movie, but is not really of any great interest or relevance, introducing some aspects of cultures not relevant to the book and detailing the lengthy journey undertaken to get that far. This section of the text is likely the most historically accurate to the actual texts of Fadlan. What is interesting is the book's presentation. There's an introduction, supposedly scholarly, that introduces Fadlan as a historical figure and discusses the importance of some of his writing about the Vikings. It details over a few pages the document he wrote, that it survives in fragments to this day and in various translations, some of which had their own agenda. At the very end of the book is an afterword that investigates the Wendell as a possible remnant of Neanderthal man, and then there's a bibliography. All of this serves to create a degree of historical verisimilitude around the rest of the text, which is presented as the most complete and accurate representation of Fadlan's words. It suggests that the whole adventure is part of Fadlan's text, which seems unlikely, as what follows his arrival in the north is actually a reworking of Beowulf, down to the names of the king Hrothgar, his great hall Hurot, Bolvi's sword Runding, and the victorious display of Wendell's severed arm in the hall after the first battle, as well as the underwater passage to the duel with Grendel's mother. There is a slight switch, which is that the dragon is fought before and after Grendel's mother, but otherwise there are just a lot of similarities. The desire for consistency in this section with the earlier, more historically convincing section is an interesting literary hurdle for an author to present himself, and if we consider the narrator of the middle section to be Fadlan, then he regularly and consistently reports things he was a witness to. I saw with my own eyes how the Northmen had arrived with their wares and pitched their camp alongside the Volga, as well as noting when he is passing on information he was not witness to, or when he simply did not understand customs or behaviour. This, along with his regular calls to Allah for strength or forgiveness, and other minor details such as the regular use of archaic words such as verily and thus, mostly maintains consistency when the text moves from Fadlan's journey to the Beowulf section. However, the external narrator regularly intrudes into the narrative, and there are a lot of footnotes as well. It's all fairly effective at creating a consistent tone of both scholarly and historical realism. It's interesting, though, especially in the part of the novel where the nature of the threat is still under investigation, because it's a mixture you probably won't see in a lot of novels, with the Northmen's superstition, their changeable moods, and the inconsistent translation from Fadlan's guide, all adding to the sense of mystery. But the narrative voice occasionally is also quite flat. Still, I did not know what the Northmen called these evils, or what they thought of them, though I had viewed the handiwork of the beasts that tore men to pieces. Additionally, when drama calls for it, Crichton is quite prepared to cheat. It was dark night, the candles in the hall burned low, and a faint breeze whispered through the hall and fluttered the yellow flames. Effective scene setting in one of the novel's key dramatic moments, and one Crichton almost gets away with, but that is clearly not Fadlan's voice. An odd inconsistency, especially if you're going to write away the bulk of the action, like he does a little later on. Here is how the battle waged. Of the company of Bolvai 3 were dead, Runneth and Hauger, both earls, and Egtho, a warrior. The first had his chest tore open, the second had his spine broken, the third had his head torn off in the manner I had already witnessed. All these warriors were dead. I'm not suggesting that this is in by accident. By this point in his career, Crichton probably had a very good team of agents, editors, and proofreaders. Somebody probably would have picked this out, and Crichton probably went, oh, nobody will notice until the internet's invented and people get really pedantic. Instead, what I think is he just thought that they would get away with it. But when you have sentences like this one, I expected great fear, but I did not feel this, for I had seen the aspect of the Wendell and knew them to be creatures, if not men, then like enough to men as monkeys are also like to men, but I knew them to be mortal and they could die. If you include a sentence like that, then obviously that slight awkwardness of that narrative tone has to be maintained. If it's not, then it becomes obvious. What's surprising then is that all of this actually does work to a level. The travelogue beginning being the least interesting aspect, it still sets the tone for the minor details of the Viking lifestyle that Ibn Fadlan sprinkles into his narrative. These are occasionally interesting and occasionally mildly amusing as well. These Northmen are most sensitive and touchy about their honour. Among their company, duels occur as frequently as micturition. The style of its presentation as a real historical text is unusual enough to make this interesting, but it isn't always to the novel's advantage. As shown, the battles cheat the narrative voice and then cheat their own dramatic build-up in order to maintain tonal consistency, or perhaps simply because Crichton didn't feel comfortable writing the action. Picking up this text, expecting it to lead to a greater development of the characters or events in the 13th Warrior, will only lead to disappointment. Good as it is, its presentation and brevity make it hard to recommend over simply watching the 13th Warrior for reasons other than curiosity. That attempt at historical realism being much of that novelty, as well as a strange choice, and one that I suspect makes the novel less accessible, enjoyable, and commercial. Despite that, Eaters of the Dead works, like the movie, just well enough to be worth your time. I occasionally hoped, that there was a longer cut of the movie that developed some of its minor subplots more effectively. If there is, then it isn't based on this novel, which is more or less identical. So now I can hope there's a longer version of the book that develops some of those themes as well. Thank you for watching. These videos are, as you can imagine, enormous back-breaking labour, so subscribing and ringing the notification bell makes it all worthwhile. I was asked, so I'll just clear up. Ibn Fadlan does not learn the Viking language around the campfire as in the movie. He picks up a few words as the adventure goes on, but mostly he requires a translator to communicate. Go on, that's worth a like.